everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's guest is the writer, artist, and at least partial colorist of the new DSTLRY series, One for Sorrow. It's Jamie McKelvie. Thanks for coming on, Jamie.
Oh, hi, how's it going? Partial colorist. That's a new one. Add that to my CV.
Well, I mean, it says colors, Jamie McKelvie, colors, Courtney Vokey, and then there's flats by Kai Ellis. And so I'm like, I don't know how that works.
Well, we can talk about that. Yeah, definitely.
How does it work?
So flats, I mean, a majority of colorists use a flatter for comics, which, if you don't know, is sort of like placing the basic blocks of color on the page so that then the colorist can use that to color it how they want to. It sort of saves a lot of time. And I guess just most comics don't credit the flatter, so it's not so much that it's like an unusual thing. It's just as a job, it's just that I just wanted to like credit everyone who's worked on the book, and because it's my book, I can. And co-coloring. So originally, I was going to color the book completely myself, but just through time constraints, I wasn't able to. But my friend Vokey, so Courtney Vokey is their full name, but they're just Vokey. In the same way to Kieran, I'm just McKelvie.
Sure.
So yeah, Vokey is a graphic designer by trade, but always wanted to sort of get into comics. And as I was working on the pages, I just gave them some of the pages to just like try out and just, see how they like it. And they're so good at like mood and storytelling and all these things that are really important in color. And sort of like they sort of got what I was going for, but because they've not got a background in it, they didn't have like the technical know-how, like the literally, the things like ink levels and blah, 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 and all that kind of stuff. So it was kind of teaching them that kind of stuff as we were going. And in terms of like, it's kind of hard to explain, but like they do a version of the page and then I would tweak it. And some of them, it wasn't much. Some of them, it was quite drastic because like what I saw in my head is not always easy to explain to somebody else. But basically like each page has like a bit of each of us on it. So it's like a collaboration, and whether that would change across the book to be more Vokey by themselves, or I don't know, we'll see how it goes. I mean, the aim is to like, by the end of this book, they can, just go out as a colorist by themselves because that's what they want to do. And like, I think this is going to be a really good sort of showcase for them because they, like I said, really grasp sort of the mood and the vibe and like coloring for story and focus and all these kind of things that sometimes it can be quite hard to teach. A lot of it sort of is almost not instinctive necessarily, but like if you've got an eye for it or you haven't, and it's like really valuable in coloring. So it's really cool. And I hope that, I hope they go on to do some other stuff after this.
I do think it's interesting. I could make a baseball reference here. I don't know if you know much about baseball, but in baseball, there's a pitcher who starts the game, and then there's the pitcher who closes the game, and it's a starter and a closer. And it kind of seems like that's almost your setup for the coloring is Vokey does that first run, and like sometimes that means the closer you only comes in to finish like the very end, and sometimes that means Vokey needs a little bit more help, and so you have to finish more of the job or correct more of the job and stuff like that to get it to where you're at. I don't want to oversimplify it, but it's like the flatter kind of provides the basis, like the kind of building blocks for the colors. And then Vokey is the person who comes in and kind of really formalizes all of it. And you kind of just finish the job to some degree.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And like it's, so I, as I'm a control freak, what I provide in black and white is maybe more than some people. So like I do like the placement of the shadows and everything, which and the highlights in black and white, which a lot of people actually do these days, especially people who work in like gray tones and stuff. But traditionally was the colorist's job to place shadows and things. But I'm also like, I was doing that on this book because at the time I thought I was coloring it. And so I kind of also want to give them a few pages without that. Because I've got a feeling they're going to do a good job with that kind of thing as well, because they understand like direction of light and everything. Yes, you've got analogy, but it was such a kind of like unusual process this time. It was like more like a back and forth. I don't know if I'm making any sense to anybody other than me, because
it totally makes sense. I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about where you're at in your career is you're going from a very long run of working with writer Kieran Gillen, colorist Matt Wilson, and letterer Clayton Coles, where it's like the four of you just know how to do everything together, and that's just how it is. Now you're kind of finding your position of what am I like when I'm kind of a solo act, and then I need to find other people who can kind of complement my work. And it seems like you're going from a point of extreme high awareness and extreme high knowledge in your collaborators to what is the ideal way to work with these people who I trust, but also we're all figuring each other out still.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like I'm really excited to be like working on the colors for issue 2 with the knowledge that Vokey's gained over issue 1 and seeing like how much I can step back, because I really, like I say, I really got a feeling it's not going to take me long to sort of like hand it all off entirely, I think. And it's been sort of really enjoying it. Like when somebody's sort of new to comics, because there's so much, one of the big problems with comics in general, I think, is there's not a lot of formal education or information out there necessarily unless you're already working in it. Like, and even then, if you're working for a publisher a lot of the time, you have to ask for certain specifications or whatever. And so it's a lot to learn at once, and that can take some time. But like Vokey's picked it all up so quickly. It's been brilliant.
I know you posted about this on Blue Sky yesterday as of our recording. There was a thing going around talking about the idea that comic creators were talking about their influences, and it was all comic creators, and like how healthy it is to have influences outside of comics. I do think it's actually kind of interesting to see somebody like, you're talking about Vokey comes from a graphic design standpoint and probably not necessarily a comic one. And I bet it's pretty interesting to see what they're coming up with as somebody who doesn't have, maybe has a comic background, but also is not so kind of like locked into this is the way things are.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. Yeah. It's what I was saying yesterday was sort of, it should be the norm that comics sort of pulls in influences from all the different places, because it is kind of like I don't say necessarily underdog medium, but it's definitely like a sort of scrappy medium that sort of has always pulled in influences from everything else, and like everything from like obvious pastiches to just like different art, different stories and whatever. I kind of feel like, I don't want to write off the 90s because there was some good stuff coming out in the 90s, but I do feel like what happened in 90s superhero comics especially was it just became about referencing itself, like, and only sort of learning from itself. And I think that was kind of like detrimental in a lot of ways. And one thing me and Kieran have always been like, was like, yeah, we're on all these different influences because that's the stuff we love. And we want to make stories about the stuff we love and using the stuff we love. And yeah, going back to Vokey, like, they also just did the design for the Wicked covers book that we did for Kickstarter, because that's the sort of thing they normally do, or like website stuff as well. And it is, I guess I've always kind of had a style that also lends itself to that kind of, I don't really know how to put it, graphic style, I suppose, but like a design sense as much as a like storytelling sense, I suppose. And they definitely kind of come from that sort of background as well. And it does mean that, a lot of the color choices are, I think, derived from that. I mean, you'd have to ask them personally, but it does feel like that. You're right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Why do you think your art lends itself to that kind of style?
Partly because of like just the clean aspect of it, which, I've talked about this before, I think, but like it wasn't necessarily deliberate, but it is sort of a result of my limitations. So like I'm hypermobile, which means my joints don't work properly, which means I'm not as stable as a lot of people. So I can't have as much control over my lines and my line work as I'd like. And what that meant in the early days when I was drawing on paper was like, well, I just can't do hatching or anything because I can't draw the lines with that sort of control to have it look in any way good. So I just tried to find something that didn't use that. And so I sort of developed the style out of that. And I definitely think like that means it kind of, like you see a lot more like, I suppose cleanness, the word for it, like outside of comics than in, like a lot, especially mainstream comics. There's a lot of hatching and various different ways of describing texture. You don't necessarily see out of, like, I'm always thinking about like the stuff that Marvel sell merch-wise to non-comics readers, like t-shirts and whatever, they're in supermarkets or wherever. It's always the 60s stuff. Like it always uses the 60s artwork rather than like modern stuff, which I always find really interesting. And I think it's because like, I don't know if this is definitely the reason, but it feels like because it's the sort of simpler, more, I guess it becomes more sort of iconic in a way, and certainly more easily identifiable as a sort of like pop culture thing. And I suppose that's part of it. That makes sense.
Yeah. I mean, it is interesting how there's been this shift towards like more detail, more detail, more detail.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, like a lot of the most enduring images are like the ones that you're talking about, are the ones that are, I don't know, like simpler feels like insulting, but you know what I'm saying? It's like,
Yeah, no, it's not at all. Yeah. That's why it's difficult to talk about, because it does sound like sort of insulting, and it's not that at all.
no, I mean, it's kind of funny too, because it's like, I think some of the most, I mean, you look at the most successful comics of today, and a lot of them have quote unquote simpler art. It's like Raina Telgemeier, Dave Pilkey. I mean, even a lot of manga. Like, I don't want to. Obviously, there's a lot of really great work in there, but a lot of like the character work is very simple stuff, and it's like very effective because of that. And like, also, it's like it's black and white, so it betrays the concept that all colors or all comics need to be in color to be successful. That concept was kind of eradicated though already, because Scott Pilgrim and Walking Dead and assorted others. But that's an entirely different path we could go down.
Yeah.
I want to talk about the path to One for Sorrow, your new book at DSTLRY, and what went into that today. But before we do that, I do want to kind of set it up, because we talked about this a little bit when you came on the podcast last time. I think it's worth bringing it up again. The book that you were originally going to do after The Wicked and the Divine was The Killing Horizon, the image series you were writing and drawing that was announced back in October 2019. You had mentioned on the podcast before that you ran into this nightmare situation where you basically lost all the developmental files for the series during a data transfer for a computer upgrade. So we don't have to cover that again. But I am interested in what that development process did for shaping what you wanted to do next, because regardless of whether or not you lost those files, you put all the thought into it. You put all the work into it. You were thinking about all of it. How do you think that the work that went into The Killing Horizon shaped what you ended up doing next?
That's a good question. It was really demoralizing losing the work. And like one of the, I mean, for anybody it would be, but one of the things with ADHD is momentum is really important. And if you lose momentum on something, it can be very, very difficult to pick it up again. And so it sort of made me struggle to work at all for a while. And certainly on that project, it was just like, I've been piecing it back together slowly, but like, it's a lot. Yeah. To think about and to get working on. And then, so I suppose, I mean, this is another book that required a lot of research. So apparently I like to do that to myself.
The Killing Horizon or One for Sorrow, or both?
Both. So, because Killing Horizon, one of the things I wanted to do with it was make it quite hard science. And I'm sort of, in that respect, I mean, like, the science is as accurate as it could be until the point that it gets in the way of the story. Kind of like, I suppose, like The Expanse is probably the best example of that kind of thing, and just been successful, you know. But that does require a lot of research. And so I've done all that kind of stuff. And then come around to this book, setting something in 1900 in London, also requires enormous amount of research. If I wanted to be, if accurate is the right word, but like feel, I don't necessarily want to use the word authentic either, because that's sort of,
I feel like it's a good time to throw down one of my favorite words. I feel like verisimilitude is a very good word here, because it's like the appearance of truth. You want people to feel like it's real without necessarily being like, I'm covering what people in 1900s London were eating or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, I know with a book like this as well, you've got to balance the realism of it with how a modern audience reads a comic, which is something I can get into as well. But I'm just trying to think. I think it basically, I always feel like I didn't learn any lessons.
Sure, that's fair.
Because I did a lot of the same things to myself again, which was create a story that requires a lot of work beforehand. But certainly, I think it sort of gave me a confidence in creating a story in terms of creating a structure for it, but also leaving myself enough room for that to change as I was working on it. Because when you're working on this isn't a bigger story necessarily, it's like the equivalent of like 6 issues or so of regular comics, but it still needs a good structure to it. Previously, I might have been really nervous in terms of like, I want to make sure everything is in place before I write it so that I know I'm not going to screw up. Well, I think it sort of gave me the confidence to know that I can have the basic stuff in place, but be a bit more loose with it. And I've really benefited from that with this story, I think, because there's a lot of things that came about with the writing of it that weren't there in the original pitch and structure that benefit the book quite a lot, I think. So,
do you think that there's any part of the genre of The Killing Horizon that might have pushed you in kind of the opposite direction, going hard sci-fi to like, regardless of the level of research, like one is theoretical to some degree, it's science-based, but it's at the same time, it's like science, like sci-fi, versus One for Sorrow, which is, besides some fantastical elements, is something that's already like an era that's already happened that you can build from in an easier way. Do you feel like that developing the Killing Horizon might have pushed you in the opposite direction genre-wise at all?
I don't think so. I think it's just more, this is the story I want to do next.
Yeah.
Because after this, there's a science fiction thing I want to do. And I think it's one thing I do worry about a little bit in that I don't really stick to the genre. And even like moving between genres, there's no sort of like slow path. I just hop between the things I want, which is very reflective of how I am as a person in general and where my interests are. It wasn't that at all. It was just like, this was the next story that came along that I was excited about. So I think, I'm not very good at planning career-wise or anything like that. So It wasn't necessarily something I considered, this is maybe considered it after, it's like, oh, no, people going to expect this or want this from me. But at the same time, I quite like the idea that like the next book comes along won't be something that someone expects.
Yeah.
Yeah, so...
I do think it's the idea of kind of counter-programming your own career is an interesting thing, because I think the people who like your work, whether it's your writing or your art, are going to like it regardless of the subject matter. And it's like, they're coming for you. They're not coming for the fact it's like, I need Jamie to do a sci-fi book or something like that. And being able to see different flavors of you, I think is really fascinating. Like One for Sorrow, it's interesting. There's a part of me that kind of feels like it's counter-programming to a lot of your other work. And it's hard to disentangle that from the fact that a lot of your previous work was with Kieran. So it has kind of like the Kieran flavor to it too. But it definitely feels unique relative to a lot of your other work in like the best of ways.
Yeah. It is interesting you say, because obviously I worked with Kieran so much and for so long. There's also a sense that a lot of people sort of think that we're the same person in respect to like what we're interested in, not necessarily physics, but like
yeah.
I mean, on a silly level, like after the second phonogram came out and people would be wanting to talk to me about the pets, I'm like, I don't like the pets. Kieran loves them, and he wrote the story, so they feature prominently. Like there is this sort of sense that like we have the same tastes and we have the same interests and we have the same what sort of stories we want to tell, which isn't to say there isn't a lot of me in those books, especially something like Wictive. But yeah, we do sort of have definitely different interests in where we want to go with our stuff. So I guess this is sort of the first thing. Yeah, this is the first thing since sort of that partnership, other than a couple of bits here and there, for people to see me by myself. Yeah. So I don't know if there's an element of like, deliberately being difficult in that respect and just like, this is something completely different. But yeah, it's also, like I say, it's just, this is the book I was excited about.
I do think it's interesting that it's like sometimes I think creators have to like fight a perception of who they are based off of their work, especially when it's something like this. And it's not saying that you're not happy that you've done so many things with Kieran, but it like even the very idea, like I brought this up a million times, the idea of like the faux cartoonist, the fact that you form one collective voice, but that collective voice isn't necessarily representative of the two of you in totality. And the idea that like there's this perception that it's like, I know who Jamie McKelvie is because I've read Young Avengers and The Wicked and Divine is not completely inaccurate, but also not completely accurate.
Yeah, absolutely. And like in some ways it's a testament to the success of our work together, because like you say, like we always try and present a book that feels like it came from one person. It's not like the elements aren't fighting each other. So on one level, I totally get it. Yeah, absolutely. It will seem like we more in common taste wise or whatever than we actually do. But yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So before we get into One for Sorrow, I am curious about the distillery of it all, because, before this you did Batman, One Bad Day, Catwoman. We talked about that previously. It's a great comic. You did some work at Marvel for designs, covers, and writing. But then you were announced as one of the founding creators of Distillery, the newer publisher from Chip Mosher and David Steinberger, previously of Comixology. It's interesting. The Killing Horizon was at Image. This is at a completely different place. What made Distillery an appealing move for you?
A few things, I guess. Like frankly, the deal is pretty good, which is always a consideration. The sort of realism of it, but also the format and stuff seems really appealing to me. Like the oversized books, literally both the pages themselves and the thickness of them, the number of pages. And it was just something new and interesting.
Was the magazine format part of the pitch to you?
Yes, yeah. It was always like it was going to be like the European style pages, and it's a weird thing to say, and I'm not sure that I can rationalize it, but like I've always felt that American comic pages are too narrow.
That's fair.
It's always been a struggle working on comic, like it's something I've always battled with. And I don't know that's whether because it's just a question of like regular paper over here, A4 is wider compared to the height than American like letter. So it just always felt like a bit of an odd format in that respect. And this felt more natural to me, and that was really appealing. Also, I was sort of like one of the last to sign on, I think. And so I already knew the strength of the other creators involved. A lot of them are really good friends of mine. A lot of them are really sort of, respect their work. And it felt excited to be part of that as well. Yeah, just a bunch of good reasons. And like, it felt like a good opportunity to try something new. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I do think it's interesting too that so you had your first story debuted in The Devil's Cut, the anthology that they released first as their first release. And your story was called What Happens Next. It's amazing. I think it's a great story. It was Aditya that lettered that, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That was just a fantastic comic. I do think it's interesting. One massive difference between your story and most everyone else's one in that. I think it was just you and Ram V and Lee Garbett who had like standalone one-shot short comics that wasn't debuting something else. I'm curious as to why you went that route. Did you not have One for Sorrow percolating yet? Or is it just like, this is me figuring things out in this format and I just want to try something different?
I did have it ready. Well, not ready, but like I pitched it and like I knew what it was going to be and everything. But I didn't feel there was a story worth telling as a like sampler to it.
It would be a weird 8-page story.
Yeah. So I think it's only 5. It's 5 pages.
Oh, it's 5.
I might be wrong. It's been a while. But yeah, I didn't feel that it would be beneficial to One for Sorrow to have that sort of intro to it. And then I also just wanted to tell a little story by itself. And maybe that's just sort of like the 2000 idea of it, the future stock style thing. And I really enjoyed the challenge of telling a complete story that feels satisfying within that small amount of space. And that's kind of where that came from. And yeah, on the practical level, it was just like, there's nothing that One for Sorrow would gain from doing that first. But there were only a couple of other stories that did the same sort of thing, which was interesting, yeah.
Do you feel like taking that comic on helped you better understand the format from a creative standpoint? Do you think it influenced One for Sorrow in that way?
Yeah, absolutely. Because I quite like writing fairly densely anyway. I think the trend these days is to not be dense. Not in the same way as it was decompression, sort of like the 2000s and the 2010s. It's still, especially with mainstream comics, like 5 panels, 6 panels max. And that's not necessarily how I think, which is, I always find it's kind of interesting in the fact that I'm come from mostly drawing comics. You might expect somebody who comes from the art side of things to like want to open things up as much as possible. I always kind of like the sort of denser side of things. And this is my first time doing it on this scale, literal scale of the page, and figuring out how much works, how much is too dense, how much feels okay. And yeah, so it's definitely, what can I do with this format? And so I think this book benefits from that as a result. Yeah.
I think it's funny that you say that like the idea is that artists would probably write a little bit more open, to like have the art be the focus. I remember one time I was talking to an artist who said that when they were first getting into writing, they talked to a writer and they're like, artists always write too dense. They always write too much because like they it takes them for a while to learn that like less is more from a writing standpoint. And I don't know if that's necessarily always true, because I do feel like I think a lot of artists that become writers operate more like you were talking about, where that's, if you have a chance to let a person's face say that instead of a bunch of words, you do that. That's actually part of the reason why I like your writing a lot is, I mean, not to go back to the counter programming thing, but it kind of feels like opposite of a lot of trends. And it actually reads a little bit richer because of that. Not to toot your own horn too much, but I mean, I feel like it's a unique thing for One for Sorrow and your other stuff in both ways. But no, before we get into One for Sorrow, I did have one last question. I mentioned Catwoman. I mentioned the Marvel stuff you did. I mentioned taking the distillery dill. What's your process for finding the right answers for yourself from a project standpoint? Is it just vibes, or do you kind of like have a rational, formal approach to this? What guides you?
There's no rationality to it whatsoever. I don't think. I mean, other than like literal, financial considerations, because after WicDiv, I was really, really burnt out. Couldn't properly work for quite a while, which meant I wasn't earning money. So then that is a factor. Yeah, it really varies. Like, so with Catwoman, the main draw was because I wanted to work with Willow, because I designed Ms. Marvel like 10 years ago, which is horrifying to think about. But that's all I've ever done with one. But we've been friends since, and I always wanted to work with it because I love her work. So that was an opportunity to do that. And then, a lot of it is just, is this going to be fun? Is this going to be interesting? Is it just going to be working with people I want to work with? And is this doing a story that will appeal to me enough to get through it? Because it's a lot of work a lot of the time, and I don't want to not give my all to it if I'm not kind of not interested in it. It is pretty vibes based, I suppose, now that I think about it.
Is the new an appealing hook to you? Because I can't help but notice working with Willow for the first time, designing new looks for characters. When you did Captain Carter, writing for somebody else, I think for the first time. I mean, even DSTLRY, DSTLRY is, regardless of the names attached to it, it's a big different swing for comics. Is that a hook for you?
Oh yeah. Yeah, for sure. Which is, again, extremely ADHD. The new is very appealing in general. But yes, that's always I haven't done that before. I don't want to keep doing the same thing over and over again, ever. So yeah, that is a very strong sort of pull.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors in Oni Press. 20 years, 7 evil X's, one huge celebration. Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life was released on August 18, 2004, and for the 20th anniversary, creator Brian Lee O'Malley designed some outstanding new merch. Pre-order is now open on the official Scott Pilgrim 20th Century merchandise line, celebrating 20 years of the iconic Scott Pilgrim series with a selection of brand new and classic designs newly remastered by O'Malley himself. Listeners of Off Panel can use the code SKETCHED15, that's SKTCHD, all caps 15, for 15% off their order of exclusive Scott Pilgrim merch at onipress.com. But hurry, this pre-order closes on December 2nd. And now, back to the show.
Well, I mean, doing a comic set in 1900 London is definitely a new turn for you. So let's talk about One for Sorrow, your DSTLRY series that just launched on November 6th. It's you, co-colorist Courtney Vokey, flatter, Kai Ellis. Kai could also flatter people quite a bit. I don't know.
Yeah. She tells me I'm great all the time.
Letterer Ariana Marr and editor Katie West. Here's the solicit. London 1900. A monstrous figure stalks the city's criminal underworld at night, leaving a trail of bloody corpses in its wake. 3 individuals, strangers to each other, might together have the answer. Madame Hendrikov, the Russian medium, Bess Turner, the barmaid caught up in an organized crime gang, and Ignatius Thorne, the world's most famous consulting detective. It is a great comic. I've read the first issue. I absolutely loved it.
Thank you.
I'm going to split this into a spoiler-free part and a spoiler-filled section. We will start with spoiler-free, so feel free to stick around. I will note it when we hit there. Let's start with the basics. What was the origins of this idea and project for you?
So it was a role-playing game, Blades in the Dark. I don't know if you know the game, but it's...
I've only because I've seen you talk about the fact that it inspired one of the characters in here, and I've always wondered which character it was.
Yeah. So, well, that I'll probably have to say for the spoiler section. So, yeah, it was a game, Blazing Dark, which is a role-playing game set in a kind of steampunk isn't the right word, but alternate history kind of thing with different technology world where the sun has died, and so everything's always moody and dark, and everything's lit by whale oil lanterns and things, and everyone's in this city where there are ghosts and things and mysterious things happening, and you play this group of criminals, a gang, together doing heists. And it's kind of the system's great. The way it works, you don't plan ahead. The person running the game doesn't necessarily put a bunch of prep into it, but you start the heist, and then you'll do through the mechanics. You can create these flashbacks. So I've got this gun that I prepared and I've hidden over here, so I can put it out. And then depending on how it goes, it might work in your favor or not. And so Kieran was running a game of that. It was me, Katie, and a couple of other friends, and my character in that, and created. One of the things with Blazing Dark is it's one of those games where it's not necessarily designed to run for a very long time. You have kind of short campaigns of it. And so I was left at the end of this story with all these questions about my character, because especially one of the things about this genre of game is you play to find out. You don't necessarily know all the answers about yourself and your character before you start. I left all these questions that I was just thinking about, and that was sort of the genesis for this comic. It was what can I do with that character? Those changed a lot since then. But, that was kind of because, it's not a license plate in the dark comic for a start, but it evolved from that. And then it became, well, what do I do with this character and what kind of setting do I have it in? And for various other reasons in the book, obviously there's a character who's a very clear Sherlock Holmes analog.
Right.
A bit later on in his life, but so that sort of would naturally put it at this time. The various other parts of the story kind of worked for that. And at one point I was considering should I maybe make this into kind of a sort of cyberpunky type comic, set it in the future? But then I felt like I was only really doing that to try and make it popular or zeitgeisty or something. It wasn't anything inherent in the book that made it the story to tell. So that became it sort of has to be this, and it all kind of led from there. But the vibes were very much like The Blazing Dark is kind of foggy nighttime, murders and crime, and nobody's really a good person kind of thing, which is definitely something that you can see the genesis of One for Sorrow there.
It is interesting to kind of think about all the characteristics in there, because it seems like you really built from that character. But then there's definitely the Sherlock Holmes of it, which we'll get into more in the spoilers section, really permeates throughout the entire story and kind of creates one of the unique flavors to it. Well, I'll put it like that, which we'll talk about that later. But you've also described the series as John Wick meets Crimson Peak, which I find to be a really amazing combination. It's interesting how, we were talking about influences outside of comics. Literally everything we're talking about is not even comics. And it's interesting how that kind of all forms into this perfect stew of what becomes One for Sorrow, a comic named after a nursery rhyme featuring magpies, and a comic that features a killer called the Magpie. Amazing stuff there, Jamie. It's just if we were talking about trying to get to know you, this is a tour of the different influences in your brain and the different things that kind of form together to form a single idea.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny with the title as well, because all of the concepts that came first, the title was sort of the last thing, because it seems so obvious. I'm I can't call it that, can I? That's the most obvious thing to call it. But then, of course, I have to call it that because it's the most obvious thing to call it, especially, as the sort of issue plays out, when you get towards the end of the first issue, you realize that sort of relevance as well. So the One for Sorrow rhyme, a lot of rhymes and fairy stories and stuff, has been sanitized over time. So if you go back to earlier versions of it, it's a lot less pleasant. One for Sorrow, and then there's not a lot of joy after that, which again made it perfect. Once I started looking to that, but yeah, it's definitely, like you were saying, Crimson Peak and John Wick and stuff. And I think the John Wick of it you start to see it a bit in this issue. It comes more into the second issue once sort of all the pieces are in place. Mm-hmm. It was very much I want to do a John Wick style action movie, but smush it together with a gothic fiction Edwardian ghost story, because why not? Yeah. So,
yeah. The funny thing about this book, and when I emailed you and we were talking about you coming on the podcast and everything, you're like, can we do it after the book comes out? Because it'd be a lot easier to talk about then. And it's interesting because the final 4 pages, let's say 4 pages, probably more like 3, really change kind of what you think this story is. And it's very interesting in that regard. And one of the things I think is really fascinating, again, I don't want to get into spoilers yet, but it's it makes rereading the first issue a very interesting experience. I actually reread it 2 nights ago, and rereading it, and I was like, oh, this was all there. You don't really notice it until you actually know where you're going.
It's quite a challenge to write that, because obviously you have to hope that, you have to try and make it something that's enjoyable to read the first time.
Right.
Before you know that. But then also work once you know that. And it was a bit of there's a couple of worries there. One is it's really hard to promote a book like that in a way that sells what's different about it, I suppose, because you can't sort of reveal things that you necessarily would trying to sell the book as well. Well, not sell, but talk about it, because it does sort of transform the pages before it, which is a thing we've done before, especially that something Wick did. There's been moments where, towards the end of it, especially, we've said, once you've read this issue, the entire rest of the series before it is completely changed. So if you do want to reread it, now's the time. The other problem is, because this is oversized, because it's 46 pages of comic, there is the challenge to keep the reader interested enough to get to that point without revealing that thing. A 20-page comic, you've got your if you're having a reveal at the end, that's only 20 pages to get through to keep the reader's attention, and making sure that we're hoping that the story before you knew the truth was compelling enough to get to that point and not give up halfway through was sort of a bit of a worry. And it seems to have paid off for most people, which is good.
Yeah. Do you see the Fall Guy, the Ryan Gosling and Emily Blunt movie by chance?
I haven't seen it yet. No, I want to. I mean, my consumption of any sort of stories this year has been really poor, unfortunately.
It's extremely charming, and I think you would like it. But there's this one part where this movie producer character describes something as the sexy bacon that gets people to the message of the story. And I kind of feel like your art is the sexy bacon. It's like, it's like, I'm not saying that reading in 46 pages is like by any means arduous, but if anyone did find it arduous, it's like your character work and your art is still so like magnificent. It's kind of hard to not want to just keep going forward. But I do think it's interesting. We talked about a little bit about how the format changes things, but the fact that it's 46 pages, it's 3 issues, right?
Yeah.
And it's got this core mystery. I think one of the things that's really interesting about it is trying to manage the pacing. I feel like that's got to be one of the more difficult things to figure out for this book.
Yeah, for sure. Especially as, again, we're going to hit our spoilers on your book today.
If you want me to introduce spoilers now, we can.
No, it's fine. It's just that there's a lot going on in the first issue in terms of pieces that have to be set in place.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was definitely a conscious thing I had to be aware of, like getting the pacing right while also setting everything up and revealing everything that needs to be revealed and having enough room to get the different characters and all that kind of stuff. I sort of enjoy controlling pace through how I break up paneling and conversation and character sort of moments and reactions and things, like choosing those moments. And it kind of, I almost feel like by focusing on the smaller bits like that, the overall pacing kind of comes out of that in a way that seems to work. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's an interesting challenge as well because it is those oversized issues broken into 3 rather than your traditional 20-page segments of a 6-issue story. It does affect where you drop certain bits of information.
Mm-hmm.
Like that reveal, traditionally, like I say, it would have been at the end of 20 pages, but there's no way I could have got to that point in this particular story. But then at the same time, the end of issue 2 is the issue before the last issue. And like normally that would be 20 pages before the end of the story rather than 40 odd pages before the end of the story. That changes that as well.
Yeah.
So it's definitely something that you sort of really have to think about. Because originally I was, when I was first thinking about this, because I had been thinking about the story before this theory approached me. So I was thinking in traditional format. Some things did have to change quite a lot to make it work for this. I don't think it's a loss. I think it's just different. But it's kind of interesting. Yeah.
I think from an art standpoint, you can really see yourself, I don't know, spreading your wings, stretching your legs. I don't know what the right analogy is, but like the first page, the first 3 panels or first 4 panels are a character, I'm holding this up as if anybody can see it, running down a street, and then basically boots. The top one's boots going down the street. Next one's blank, and that has nobody running, and then the third one is somebody following. You would not have the second, third, and fourth panels if it was a 20-page issue, probably.
Yeah, no.
It's interesting to see what you're able to do with that additional space.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And like the longer, I think it's actually, the interesting thing is like, and I'm curious if you have a perspective on this. Are you able to do that because the bigger dimensions, or are you able to do that because the longer page count? Because it feels more like dimensions.
Absolutely, it's dimensions, yeah. And it's something like, it's something I knew I wanted to do, and I knew I could probably get away with the oversized pages. And I think that's partly because I've read quite a lot of European stuff, which does, not always, but does often have a higher panel count and does have those kind of breakdown moments to take advantage of it. And I think it's also a thing that I was confident enough in my strengths as a storyteller, knowing that I didn't necessarily have to rely on the size of a panel to have an impact. Obviously, that can be a useful tool, but I also knew I could do things more densely that would still have the impact that I wanted them to have.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was definitely absolutely taking advantage of the size of the page. Like I didn't just want to blow up what I would normally do on an American comics page. I didn't feel that was taking advantage of the difference. I've got my own copy of it here, by the way, so I was just flicking through.
Nice.
As I was, yeah. I got my cops today.
You can feel you, I don't know, enjoying yourself, enjoying the real estate you have to work with. And it's interesting to see you kind of let loose in that way. And like, I think some people might not think of it's just like, oh, it's the same comic, just printed bigger, right? No, it's like completely different dimensions, and that completely changes what you're able to do. Last question before we get into spoilers. The research, you mentioned this already. You do a lot of research. Where was the bulk of your research focused? Was it on getting like the fashion and the look of the era right? Where was it mostly dedicated to? Because it seems like that would be particularly important to making it feel authentic and correct.
I'm not sure I could easily tell you. So it's both me and Katie. Katie did a lot of visual research for me. Like I was like, I need this, I need this, I need this. But I did a bunch of it as well. But it was a real mix because yes, the looks of the characters and stuff is very important. Trying to get it quite authentic, not just in terms of fashion, but also what it says about the character in terms of class and things. Because fashion and materials and things were very class stratified. Even like the necessarily wearing like lighter fabrics because you weren't likely to get as dirty if you were richer, kind of thing. There's a lot of things like that sort of built into it. So that kind of stuff is very important, but also like the look of the environment is very important.
Newspapers.
Yeah, no, oh my God, the newspapers.
You did a good job.
Thank you. But it's a really, that's another example of like where the trying to be authentic with it is a real struggle to also make that work as a comic, because you know, if you're doing a modern comic and you want like a headline to like be part of the story, that's going to take up most of the page of the newspaper. That's easy enough to like fit onto the page and be visible. Newspapers at the time were incredibly dense and incredibly, like if you read an article, and I mean, this is also the same with speeches. There's another thing that is something to balance. Like an Edinburgh newspaper article would probably take like 3 or 4 times as many words to say the same thing as the article would do today. So I've got to try and make it feel like that, but also not be so much text that it's shrunk down so you can't read it on the page. And also that like the reader doesn't get bored with it. So he's trying to like balance that, and they don't even necessarily have to read the whole article, but they can pick out the bits that's important to the story. Yeah, names and like the general gist of like, oh, this thing's happened, like this killing has happened, blah, blah. Yeah, it's a real challenge. And that meant like researching newspapers at the time, like literally making sure like the rest of the newspapers, mostly the actual day of that newspaper and how the newspapers were sold, I don't know what you call him, but the guy like literally selling the newspapers on the streets, what he would be shouting, what he'd be carrying, all of these kind of things really important to it, I think. But the most difficult one was how banks kept their records.
Oh yeah,
the bit where Magpie breaks into a bank just to go through some bank records to steal them, and like first of all finding out how they kept them, and then finding, which is wild, these ledgers, like there's not really that much order to it. It's basically like the next blank page, then you fill in the next bit of that person's account when they're in there, and then you have to go back and find the rest of the account in another book, and it's like, how did this function? I don't know. So finding physical examples of that, like photographic examples, because you know there were cameras around then, was kind of a real challenge. And then I did a lot of research in terms of just reading fiction and non-fiction from the time to get the flavor of how people talked and how people wrote. And I was also quite lucky that this was a period where there started to be more audio recordings as well. So I could listen to people. So like I could listen to people in London working class, people in London middle upper class. There's quite a long interview with Arthur Conan Doyle, which was quite useful to listen to for Thorn, because I realized there's an element to him that's Doyle as much as it is Holmes. So that was kind of, so just everything basically. And I'm not sure I could definitely say this bit was the most, I spent the most time on.
Right.
Because it was the whole world, you know.
I do love that you have a sequence where Ignatius Thorne is researching through newspapers from the era as if he is you researching through newspapers of the era. I mean, obviously it's plot specific, but it does kind of reflect your actual experience.
Yeah, and that was the thing, like how does someone at that point go back and look at old newspapers? Because like the microfiche machines don't exist or anything, the internet doesn't exist. And you literally go to where they're stored and you like request now that would be at the British Library. Because the British Library stocks every book and newspaper ever released in the UK. But the British Library didn't exist then. And what it was a room within the British Museum at the time, which is now, it's the big round room that you see in the centre if you look at pictures of the interior. And that was where you go. So like, and I was finding out, what does that look like at that point in time, etc. And there is a point where we have to stop researching and just get on with the comic. But yeah, it was a lot.
So let's get to spoilers. Where I want to start is a kind of funny place to start. I want to talk about character design because you have three key characters, the Magpie, Bess Turner, and Madame Hendrikov, who are all really a fourth character, Maggie Weaver.
Yep.
To start with, how does that affect character design? Because in my mind, your design is uniquely important as a differentiator and as a connector. Was that something you had to think about?
Very, very much so. Because it's a lot easier to do something like that in prose than it is to do in comics or something, because in prose, you can't see the characters. So when you're dealing with something where three people are actually the same person, you can hide it. In comics, that's a lot more difficult. So like Magpie was probably the easiest because like, so Magpie, there's Maggie creating this character to scare people, to create a kind of mythology. And because of the nature of the design, it's kind of, you can hide a lot of Maggie. And she's deliberately hiding this, like she's deliberately trying to not look like a woman. And she's wearing an outfit that kind of like box up her shoulders and things. And so she's trying to look like a male character, which means that's the easiest one to trick the reader as you go along, because it's doing the same job to the reader. And one thing I'm never cheating. So like, there's definitely a couple of bits where like, if you look and you know it's Maggie, you could probably tell. Like,
are you talking about with Magpie or are you talking about with Bess?
With Magpie. So like, when she's breaking into the bank, so that first page of it, when she's standing, hiding and pressing against the wall, like as the guards in the other room, a couple of people said, "Oh, now I look at it, I can tell that's Maggie. I can tell that just the way she's standing is just slightly," and it is like I kind of like try and pay attention to that kind of thing in terms of like body language and things like that. But she's also wearing these big heavy boots, and she's got these big leather gloves that are like fencing gloves, but made to look like bird claws. That was definitely the easiest one. Bess then is a question of just like the wig and things like that makes it a kind of easier to sort of create her own character with it. I did toy with the idea of giving her freckles as well. That was like, I learnt my lesson with Laura on Wicked. Never give a lead character freckles because it takes so long and you will forget them in panels, and it's just not worth it. And then that, as I was creating the characters, Hendrikov was the sort of last one to come into focus. And I'm trying to think, like,
the veil helps.
This is the thing, yeah. So like, from Maggie's point of view, as she's kind of like investigating and trying to uncover who exactly was involved in this cover up and who exactly was involved in the thing that killed her friends, there are sort of two sides to it. There's the working class criminal element, but there's obviously a higher level conspiracy as well. She's thinking about how she can move through these worlds more easily. So Bess is the character that she's created for herself to move through the working class criminal side of things, which I think is probably easier for her because that's where she comes from. You know, she was a street orphan. Obviously, when you know the Sherlock Holmes connection, she's obviously like was a Baker Street irregular analog, her and her friends. And then Hendrikov was like the sort of one of the reasons for that character is to easily move through middle upper class society, because spiritualism and mediums and seances were a really big thing at the time. So once that character came into view, I was like, well, how do I disguise her in a way that the reader can't tell that she's obviously got the same face as Bess? And yes, the veil. That's the answer. So I'm like, okay, well, if I make her a character, it seems very fitting for a medium to be a widow. And that's also one of the reasons, like, so she kind of dresses about 10, 15 years out of date. She's wearing like much more Victorian, more than Edwardian style mourning dress, because it was starting to phase out a bit at that point. It was still wearing black and things, but it wasn't as covering your face completely in this material that turns out is really bad for you. I think that whatever they impregnated the material with gave people a lot of respiratory issues and things. One of the many things I learned while researching this book.
Sure.
So many things. Yeah. So then, obviously, but then it made sense to make this character this widow, and then she can wear a veil, and then she's got heavy shadows on her face. And again, I'm not cheating. So like, that is Bess's face under there, Maggie's face under there, but I can hide it in the shadow. And that's kind of how that. So it was a logic problem, solving the problem of how do I make this character not obviously be the same character as Bess, and that's how she ended up. And then I leant into that and developed that. Yeah. Was
Maggie your tabletop game character, or not tabletop, but
yeah. So she wasn't. It was I switched the gender for various reasons, but my character was what's his name? I'll say Edlund or something. His concept was one of the Baker Street regulars. One of his mates were killed. He's grown up and he's trying to find who did it. And he didn't discover who did it or anything in the story. That the story, that was like kind of a side thing. That wasn't what the focus of the game was about, but that was the basis of it. Yeah.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Zoop is where some of the biggest names in comics are crowdfunding. Live campaigns this month include The Art of Dave Dorman, Camille D'Erico's Parabeat art book, with Megaton Man Omnibus from Fantagraphics and Don Simpson, molds from Steve McGarry, Rick Stromowski, and more. More campaigns are coming soon to Zoop from Joe Quesada, Alex Segura, Michael Marisi, Dean Kotz, as well as the relaunch of Hack Slash the card game on Zoop's partner platform, GameFound. Zoop would like to thank all the creators who have recently submitted projects and urge more creators to submit your project to Zoop. Click the Submit Your Project link at zoop.gg as they are providing services to even more creators than ever before. And now, back to the show.
Did you read Ed Brubaker and Marcos Martin's Friday?
I started to read it, and then, like many things, I have not read the rest of it.
You understand the base concept, though. Basically, it's takes a classic trope from literature, the girl detective, and puts her into a different part of her life, making it like this post-YA story. I think that's one of the things I think is the most interesting. I mentioned earlier about how like one of the root things to the Sherlock Holmes part permeates through the whole story, which is you have Ignatius Thorne as your Sherlock stand-in. The Basilisk, I have to imagine, is Moriarty, basically. And then you have, Maggie is one of the Baker Street Irregulars, or if you watch the BBC series, they call it the Homeless Network. Kids all grown up looking for revenge. And I think it's interesting how, like Friday, it takes a familiar idea and does something interesting and new with it. And honestly, I think that's like such an interesting thing because like so many of these stories are kind of like frozen in amber. They're like stuck in time. Like you only see these Baker Street Irregulars when they're of a certain age. But what happens to them after something else bad happens, and how does that change their life? I find that super fascinating as somebody who likes a lot of different Sherlock Holmes stories. It's a very interesting wrinkle to it. I mean, it's a whole story.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. It's like, it's just a simple question that blossomed into this whole story. And it is that kind of thing. It's like, oh yeah, what next? Because these characters are, especially like a character like a Baker Street Regular, only just within the context of being useful to Sherlock Holmes. And yeah, what is their life outside of that? What's their life beyond that? Sort of a really interesting thing to explore with it. Yeah, for sure.
Well, and he's like, when you reread it, he's kind of like the character where you're like, he knows what's going on. He can kind of see in the stories, and like he's figuring things out. And I don't know, it's really interesting. I do have to say, I need to see a breakdown of Maggie's time management skills. I struggle to live one life. I'm very impressed by her ability to live, well, I would say 4. 4 is generous. It's really 3 lives.
Yeah. So, I mean, part of the tragedy is she's not really living as Maggie.
Right.
She is just living so like, but yes, she is very, very tired. That was actually one of the challenges on this book, making sure that it flowed in a way that worked in terms of where she was at different parts of and there's a couple of bits where it's like, there's a scene, which is a useful scene, but it's in that point in the story just to make sure that she can get from one place to the next.
Right. And then Lewis, like the fact that she has another person in her life that she's able to hide this from, it's very fascinating. It is interesting because, we talked about this already. How do you talk about a book where there's a core mystery? But it's also like, how do you talk about a character who's hiding everything from everyone, including the reader, which is very interesting.
Yeah. And a lot of the story, and this is actually one of the things when I was talking earlier about giving myself the space to discover the story as I was writing it, not just sticking to an outline. Neither Lewis nor Hooper, who's Bess's boss in the pub, who's a sort of local Brian, well, I guess a boss.
He's like an underboss. I don't even know what they call it.
Yeah, underboss, I guess. Yeah, he runs the pub as a kind of cover for what's going on. Like neither of those characters were as important in the outline, and they became much more important in the writing of it, and became much more tied into Maggie and what she's going through, and also obviously going to present a lot of difficulty for her as she is trying to keep all these lives going and hiding things from people. Yeah, but I mean, like, yeah, I was going to say especially, but no, both of them were that really sort of became more alive in the writing of it and became much more important and shaped later parts of the story. And it is a part of the story, like one of Maggie's tragedies, like this, she survived this thing, but it also, she's kind of been denied her own life by it because she feels that she has to do these things that she's doing. So she's pretending to be other people around people that otherwise, like, she might have the same relationship or similar relationship with, but the whole time she's lying to them.
Yeah. I mean, it's the John Wick of it all to some degree, where it's like when revenge becomes your sole reason for existence, it doesn't leave a lot of room for life in there.
No. And then the other thing with this as well, because we're going to reveal with the last page that, because one of the things with Hendrikoff is there's a possibility, like what's going on with her is real in terms of the seances and stuff, but I also lay on pretty thick that it's all an act.
She does float.
She does float, but even her partner in that scam thinks that it's all an act. And then, of course, we get to the end, like, oh no, yeah, the ghosts of her dead friends are real. She can see ghosts. They're kind of helping her, but also never letting her be her own person because all they want is revenge. And she can't get away from that. They're bound to her. And so, yeah, she can't have a life outside of this.
I have to ask, this is a completely random question. It's horrible because it involves visuals. Was the reason why Mr. Hooper became a bigger character is because the single best drawing of the entire book is this drawing of him right here? That's a great drawing.
He's gone down very well with a certain section of the readership. I'll say that much.
I imagine.
I do love that panel. I think I think you know that you can tell that I love it because I think I put that one up really early on in black and white on my Instagram when I was drawing it. I was like, yeah, that's who he is.
Do you ever have a moment where you're just like, nailed it, just completely nailed that?
Yeah, I mean, rarely.
You never hear about that.
It's one of those things, I think, which a lot of artists and writers and also script will struggle with, is that you know in your head what you want it to be, and what comes out is never exactly what you want it to be. And so you're always comparing it to the perfect version in your head.
Right.
But then when you look at other people's stuff, you don't have that perfect version. You're just you're taking it as it is. So you don't look at it in the same way. So a lot of the time, I mean, most of the time it doesn't happen, no. But there are moments when it does. And it's very nice. So that was definitely one, like, yeah, I like that drawing, but also that is who he is. That is who he is in that moment. It's almost one of those ones, again, like, I could have even dropped that dialogue, but like, I just not quite in that context, but it certainly sells who he is, sells what's happening.
And sells a certain segment of the audience too.
Yes. Yeah. It's very appealing, it turns out, especially as like it's like, no, he's a bad guy. And they're like, yeah, that's great. It's a bad guy with a coat. Oh no, that's even better.
So I was going to say, I have my Mr. Hooper take is actually, I'm going to have to steal my favorite line from Wreck-It Ralph. I think it was M. Bison of all characters who said this, where it's, oh no, it was Zangief. He said, you're a bad guy, but that does not mean you're a bad guy. And yeah. I kind of feel like Mr. Hooper is like, he's the principled mafioso. He's the principled underboss. You're just like, oh, he stuck up for her and all these different things. You're just like, I kind of like this guy. I know he's a criminal, but at the same time, is he though? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, he is a criminal, yes. But also, like, he is that kind of character. I mean, I really enjoy writing him, but also I think it is something that does appeal in a lot of different sort of, you think about John Rogers, who worked on Leverage. I mean, he did comics. He did
Blue Beetle.
The Blue Beetle, yeah.
Jaime.
Yeah. But I'm like a big fan of Leverage. I love that show.
I oddly know that. I think it's because you've talked about it a lot. There's like, for some reason, I feel like I am more aware of the things you like than other creators. Like, partially because you're the reason why I played Nier Automata and also The Outer Wilds.
Yeah, both amazing. Yeah.
Both amazing.
I love talking about the stuff I love about. Yeah.
Yeah. I could go for more of that, but yeah, I am aware of the fact you love Leverage.
So anyway, he read the comic and he brought up a comparison to Peaky Blinders, which I hadn't thought about. But it is that kind of same kind of vibe of like, it is like these aren't good people, but you enjoy spending time with them.
Yeah.
That kind of sort of like almost crime vibe to it. And that's definitely, and to a certain extent, that's Leverage as well. Like they probably lean more good, but like they're all criminals. They've all got pasts and whatever. But in terms of like panels and art, going back to like, I mean, nailed it. I have to say, like the last page in this book, I wasn't sure, like I had the idea of how I would do the ghosts, and I was like, I really hope this works. And then I did it. I'm like, no, this is exactly what I want these to look like. So that, like, I'm really pleased with that. Yeah, when those things work, it's just so good. We're in spoiler territory bit, so if you're listening, you've read it, hopefully, so you know what they look like. But like the idea of like the seeing the bones and everything underneath in pure magenta colors. And then like the sort of skin over the top in cyan, which ties into how I'm coloring the action. Like when there are action moments, like when she's there with Sutton in the previous scene and like getting to the fight with the guard. The cyan and magenta thing was one of my initial thoughts for like how to present a lot of that stuff. And yeah, when it worked, I was like, yeah, this is, and that's also one of the on a shallow level, that's also where the John Wick thing comes in, because that's a very like a lot of those sort of action thrillers are like that kind of like strong lighting, and that was an element I wanted to bring in and mix it in with the Edwardian stuff. Well, that was quite interesting. That was a very wide-ranging answer, sorry, but
no, it's totally fine. Well, I just have a couple more questions. I want to close with some stuff about you as a writer, because when I was preparing for this, I read in a League of Comic Geeks AMA that you are writing more projects, with at least 2 of those happening at DSTLRY. Obviously, I don't want to do that thing where I'm like, oh, you just started this comic, what's coming next? But I am interested in, are you mostly thinking with your writing as a writer for other artists or a writer for yourself at this point? Or is it a little bit of both?
probably mostly for me, just because, so I was thinking back to this the other day, I actually kind of started drawing because I wanted to draw the stories that I wanted to tell.
Yeah.
I wasn't like an artist first necessarily. It was just like, well, I want to make comics and I want to tell stories, so I've got to draw. And that's, yeah. So mostly for me, like I think there's one of them I'm probably going to write for somebody else. But then there was a moment when I was wondering if this is a book that somebody else should write, because can I achieve it, or what I want to achieve by me drawing it myself? But then I just thought, I love this too much to give it to somebody else to draw. It's just maybe quite selfish, I don't know, but it's my story, so screw it. Yeah, I think because I'm always thinking in terms of what's the story rather than breaking it down into the individual elements of crafting the story, that I kind of always think of it, not always, but mostly think of it as me doing all the parts, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
But then if it's a story that I don't think I'm capable of achieving what I think the art should achieve, then yes, I would be looking to somebody else to work with on it.
Like, I mean, you wrote and did the art for Suburban Glamour, and I know a lot of people have brought that up in the wake of this. But do you feel like writing, like for Captain Carter, you wrote for somebody else entirely. Do you feel like that changed how you view yourself as a writer, or even as an artist, or like how you approach those things, seeing how somebody else interprets your scripts?
I mean, it definitely makes me aware of, like, I would write for somebody else differently than how I write for myself. Various different reasons, obviously, that you've got to prove, like, I know what I mean by a certain sentence or whatever.
There's shorthand that's not available for somebody else.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, it's really a case by case basis as well. Like, you really want to be writing for the particular artist you're working with. And I think that applies to yourself as much as to anybody else. So it's kind of just an extension of that. Like, Captain Carter, first issue, I don't think I'd like seen a side by side of script and Marika's art. So like, I didn't necessarily know how it would come back, but how issue 1 came back, I mean, I developed how I wrote the rest of the series. And I think it's quite common for superhero writers to often have to write not knowing who the artist is going to be. And that is a problem.
Yeah.
Because any writer who I think probably engages with the medium will be adapting to the artist they're working with. So yeah, I think it really is just an extension of that. It's like, I know, or I think I know what I'm capable of as an artist. I think I know what I can do. I think I know where I can push myself. And so, yeah, that does affect what I write for myself.
Do you think that, I mean, it sounds like what you have coming is, if given the time, aimed at yourself as an artist?
Yeah, I think so.
Do you think at this point it's hard to, I mean, never say never, because obviously something like Catwoman could come up and like something new could come up that would appeal to you. But do you see yourself as somebody who wants to draw your own stories at this point rather than someone else's stories?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly on a long term, it's like maybe a short thing here and there. But especially as like, because of my various issues, it takes me a long time to draw stuff, longer than a lot of people anyway. I'm aware of how much time I have. I don't mean to sound like in a morbid way or anything, but like, I know what I'm capable of and what I can produce. And I've got so many things that I want to do and so many things I want to write and tell the stories I want to tell, that I just wouldn't have time to do anything long term with other people. So yeah, I mean, I never say never, but I can't see that being something in my future, I guess. Which I think might disappoint some people, especially like, because you still get people saying, "Oh, you and Kieran are going to work together." And I mean, obviously, I hate him, so no. But it's just literally just like a time thing. Like, I've got things I want to do, and like, Kieran will tell you the same. Like, he always kind of felt guilty that he was aware I wanted doing my own stuff. And he kept saying that at the same time as handing me the next script. So like, I'm excited for it as well. Like I'm excited to sort of stretch my wings in that respect and try out new things and not sit still, which is a recurring theme in this, I guess, with trying something new and try and just like writing and drawing away and stuff is new.
Yeah.
It's old because obviously I started with that, but then there's a long period where I didn't.
Well, and another kind of recurring theme is like figuring out who you are and like figuring out what you want to do and everything. And the thing is like, as much as people want to think that you are the Jamie McKelvie that works with Kieran Gillen, which you are, but you're also not only that, you're also not only suburban glamour Jamie McKelvie. I'm sure you've changed a little bit since then.
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah.
A little bit. And so it is interesting sometimes to like, I don't know. I always compare it to like Mario Kart. Mario Kart, when you like do a certain map and then you do it again, you race against the ghost of yourself. I always kind of think about like that. Yeah. It's like, how do you improve on that previous version of yourself? And I'm sure every project you see a little bit more that you've improved on, even if it's kind of hard to explain sometimes.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And like, for me, like the worst thing would be to look back at something I did 5 years ago and think that, oh, that's the same as what I'm doing now, or that's better than what I'm doing now. That would be the worst. But like, I never want to sit still in that respect. No one stands still. I do get people occasionally saying, oh yeah, we're going to do a sequel to Suburban Glamour or something. And I'm not that person anymore. I'm not the person who wrote that or drew it. And I'm certainly much older. And like, I don't necessarily want to be trying to write teens because I wouldn't have the closest to it that I did then. But yeah, like I'm always trying to get better is a thing. And I sort of view, and I think it's a double-edged sword, because I think if you're happy with what you're doing all the time, you're really not having much impetus to improve or try and get better, and you stagnate. But the flip side of that means you're never totally happy with anything, which isn't the greatest way to be. But yeah, like every project I'm always trying to improve in some way.
Well, in my eyes, you absolutely are, Jamie. But that is all I have for you. Thank you so much for coming on to talk about One for Sorrow, your career, and everything else that's going on. I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you for having me. It's always a good chat.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with cartoonist Jamie McKelvie. You can find him on Blue Sky and Instagram, and his work in One for Sorrow at DSTLRY. Big thanks to Deanna Chapman for stepping in to edit this episode. If it sounds better than usual, it's because of her. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing on Patreon. Find it on Patreon at patreon.com/offpanel. And when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast, as well as weekly content and more. On even more, subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketch at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketch on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @SketchComic or following me on Blue Sky. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Brian, David Byrne, Milton Lawson, David Wilson, Joe, Benjamin Wilkins, Chris Hacker, John Neesmith, John Auerbach, Dustin Weaver, Ninja Assassin Love Story webcomic, Brandon Heyman, Aiden Hammond, Faith Aaron Hicks, Ben Rowe, Cameron Brown, Jonathan Breen, Charlie Stickney, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Travis Gibb, Darcy Van Polkes, Tom Evans, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lambert, Brian Hull, Near Levy, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tyne IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Quill, Isaac Oren, Klaus Vandeven, Submed Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePillos, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Carino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Liana Kingus, Nick Bennett, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Stefan Hull, Philip Myra, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Giff, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwand, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, David Kelly, Jason Assey, Adam Bogert, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, David Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendrick, Ian Maxwell, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Adam Highfield, Fiona Staples, Mark Abnett, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonacos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comics Art in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song Outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out both their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode